ESG is the way to rig the system. BlackRock says ESG is the most important thing now. We're only going to focus on investment with companies with good ESG scores. So who exactly determines the ESG scores for all of these companies? Well, there are three primary companies offering ESG ratings. There is Refinitiv Holdings, there is MSCI, and Sustainalytics. But the Wall Street Journal analyzed the ESG ratings issued by these three firms for around 1,500 companies and found the ratings to be inconsistent and incomplete. So, whereas your personal credit score is usually consistent from all three major credit bureaus, the Wall Street Journal's study found companies often receive very different ESG scores from the three rating firms. Quote, nearly a third of the companies were deemed ESG leaders by one or more rating firms, but labeled ESG laggards by another. Nearly 31% of the firms had marked difference between their top and bottom score. Gee, nothing could go wrong here, right? Keep in mind that in the first half of this year alone, investors have already dumped $39 billion into companies based on these bogus ESG scores. Even though these scores are not bottom line figures like financial data, they're totally subjective, but that's what makes them so great. What in the world can be done about these wildly inconsistent ESG ratings and reporting standards for companies? Gee, wait a minute. How about a super big government? They could fly into the rescue. Of course, why didn't I think of that? A normal common sense government would say, cut the ESG bullcrap out and get back to focusing on real financial data. No, not this administration. The SEC is set to release new rules for company ESG disclosures by the end of the year. Oh, so they've been saying there's not going to be any presents on the shelf for Christmas. They had this one coming all along. The SEC is considering the creation of a new ESG disclosures board, which would, quote, have expertise in matters like climate science, alternative energy, and environmental risks. Some companies like Coca-Cola are already trying to measure the carbon emissions of their products. The question is if publicly traded companies will soon have strict ESG reporting hoops to jump through. If that happens, how soon until private companies are also required to report? And with an IRS doubling its size under Biden, how soon until private citizens must report their own ESG data too? Will we eventually have a digital carbon ration card? Sorry, in order to stay carbon neutral, you're only limited to one roll of toilet paper this month. All these giant trillion-dollar figures in monopoly money can seem meaningless. So how does this ESG gold rush work? The fast-track way is through something called a SPAC. A special purpose acquisition company. A SPAC is a shell company that raises money from investors to find some green energy company to merge with. It's a very clever workaround to a traditional IPO, because with a SPAC, the shell company can make huge projections about future profitability that IPO rules do not allow. Just since March 2020, 35 SPACs tied to green energy have raised $95 billion. Wow, that sounds like a lot of money to launder. That's just the dot-com boom. Remember that, the bust in the late 90s? That happened because, because people were dumping money into new internet companies because it was the hot thing to do way before the company had any profit at all. One SPAC recently bought a deep-sea mining company called TMC, Metals Company. TMC plans on digging up rocks from the ocean floor that contain rare metals needed to make electric car batteries. Wow, why didn't I think of that? Through its SPAC deal, TMC got $570 million in cash and is now valued at $2.9 billion, more than any mining company with no revenue to ever go public in the U.S. And by the way, TMC, they haven't mined a single rock yet. No, haven't found them yet. much less. I'm not just the rocks, but one containing EV battery materials. That'll be the day. Let's find a rock first. Like I said earlier, the ESG market is not connected to reality. The joke is, even one of the ESG credit score companies admits being green isn't what it's all cracked up to be. A managing director at MSCI says, quote, if you were to be too purist about where you set these ESG thresholds, you wouldn't end up with, you'd end up with a lot of not really investable universe. So let's just remember there's no such thing as a perfect green company. Oh. These people are frauds. The giant UN climate summit that starts this weekend in Glasgow is not about saving the world from climate change. It is about epic public-private financial deal-making. It is an all-you-can-grab money buffet. If it was just about saving the planet, why did Larry Fink of BlackRock, along with the heads of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Blackstone, get coverage last week in London for a green investor summit ahead of the UN Glasgow event? If it was about stopping global warming, why is the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen going to Glasgow with President Biden, along with the National Economic Council Director Brian Deese from Blackstone? And of course, Larry Fink will be in Glasgow too. Surely, I'm being cynical by saying the Glasgow summit is actually just one giant money-making scam. That's the way I feel until I see John Kerry again.
A lot of money will, in fact, be made by people who get ahead of this curve. And our hope is that in Glasgow, the private sector will be front and center, helping with the finance necessary to do what we need to do.
Right. Public-private partnerships. They never work out for the public. Meanwhile, the private half of that equation built their beachfront mansions with zero fear that climate change is going to harm a single shingle of their house. In America, the middle class will be left holding the bag when it comes to all of these green investments. If not directly through higher taxes, it will be through inflation and ridiculous energy and food prices. We're already seeing it, but it will get worse. A new study in Nature finds that reducing carbon emissions by 95% in the U.S. by 2050 will cost 12% of the U.S. GDP per year. That's $4.4 trillion per year. Let me put it this way. All of us will owe $11,300. Every single person in America will owe $11,000 every year to be able to hit President Biden's emissions target. That's on top of the tax burden you already bear. The Great Reset works only for those engineering the reset. And the next phase of their plan, they start designing this weekend in Glasgow.